She endured humiliation from her husband and mother-in-law until one day she decided to change everything. They thought she was incapable of anything, but they couldn't imagine the blow she would strike back. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. Layla had always believed in hard work, perseverance, and the kind of independence that came with years of sacrifice. She had spent the better part of her 20s buried in medical books, working exhausting shifts and climbing her way to success. Now, as a respected cardiothoracic surgeon in New York, she had everything she had ever dreamed of except perhaps love. That was before Jason Barclay. Jason had entered her life like an unexpected storm. He was charming, sophisticated and confident in a way that only men who had been raised in wealth could be. Their first meeting had been at a gala where Layla had been an invited guest through her hospital's board of directors. At first, she had thought he was just another wealthy socialite, but their conversation had drawn her in. He wasn't just another rich man, he was intelligent, well-spoken, and most importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in her. Their courtship was fast-paced, almost dizzying. Lavish dates, weekend getaways, whispered promises in the dead of night. Jason made her feel special in a way no man ever had before. He never made her feel like she was an outsider in his world, even though she knew deep down that she was. She had worked for everything she had while he had been born into his privilege. Still, he never made it seem like it mattered. When he proposed, it caught her off guard. They had been dating for just over a year when he took her to a private estate in the Hamptons for the weekend. The evening had been perfect, dinner under the stars, a soft ocean breeze, and Jason down on one knee holding out a diamond ring that glittered under the moonlight. For a moment, she hesitated, not because she didn't love him, but because she knew what marriage to him would mean. Jason was the son of a powerful Southern family, one that had built its wealth on generations of cotton plantations and business acumen. The Barclays were old money, the kind that still clung to its traditions, the kind that dictated who was considered worthy. Layla had never met them in person, but she had heard enough to know that she wasn't the kind of woman they had envisioned for their son. She had grown up in a middle-class household in Brooklyn, the daughter of hard-working parents who had instilled in her a sense of resilience and ambition. She had not been raised among the elite, nor had she attended Ivy League schools like Jason and his friends, and above all she was black, a fact she knew would not sit well with a family as deeply rooted in Southern aristocracy as his. Yet Jason had assured her that it didn't matter, he loved her, that was all that counted. So she had said yes. The wedding was small, almost shockingly so for a family as wealthy as the Barclays. There were no grand ballrooms, no extensive guest lists filled with high society names. Instead, the ceremony was a quiet, understated affair at an estate in Charleston, attended only by close friends and immediate family. Layla had thought, perhaps naively, that this was a gesture of compromise, a way for Jason to make things easier for both of them. It wasn't until the ceremony was over that she realized the truth. The Barclays didn't want a grand wedding because they didn't want to celebrate their union at all. His parents had been polite but cold. His mother, Eleanor Barclay, had barely spoken to her beyond the necessary pleasantries. His father, Richard Barclay, had shaken her hand stiffly, offering nothing more than a murmured congratulations. As for the guests, they had been even less subtle. Layla had seen the way they had looked at her, the sidelong glances, the whispers behind raised champagne glasses. She wasn't one of them. Even as she stood at the altar exchanging vows with the man she loved, she felt the weight of that truth settled deep in her chest. After the ceremony, when they had returned to Jason's family estate for the reception, she had overheard a conversation between two women near the garden terrace. "She's beautiful," one of them had said, her tone dripping with something that wasn't quite admiration. "Yes, but unexpected," the other had replied. "Unexpected?" Layla had excused herself to the restroom staring at her reflection in the mirror wondering if she had made a mistake. But Jason had found her not long after wrapping his arms around her and whispering promises against her temple. "This is just how they are," he had said. "Give them time." So she had. She had convinced herself that things would change, that once they saw who she was beyond the color of her skin, beyond her background, they would accept her. But the Barclays didn't change. 2 days after the wedding, Jason brought her to the family's main estate, a sprawling southern mansion that had stood for nearly 2 centuries. The moment she stepped inside, she knew she had walked into a world that wasn't meant for her. The house was elegant but oppressive, its grandeur heavy with history. The walls were lined with portraits of ancestors, all of them white, all of them staring down at her as if they knew she did not belong. From that day forward, Layla understood one thing. She had married Jason, but she had also married his family. And his family did not want her. Eleanor made it clear in the subtlest of ways. The way she ignored Layla's opinions when it came to household matters, the way she subtly excluded her from family conversations, the way she made plans for the family business and left Layla entirely out of them. Richard, on the other hand, was not so subtle. He made no effort to hide his disdain, speaking about her as though she were a temporary inconvenience rather than his son's wife. And Jason, despite all his reassurances, never confronted them. Every time she brought it up, he would sigh, kiss her forehead, and tell her to ignore them. "They'll come around," he would say. But they didn't. Instead, the isolation deepened. The estate became her prison, the walls closing in around her. She was no longer Layla, the brilliant surgeon from New York. She was simply Jason's wife, a title that came with no real standing, no real voice. And she began to realize that love alone would not be enough to save her. Layla had always imagined marriage as a partnership, a union where 2 people supported each other, grew together, and built a life side by side. But within the walls of the Barclay estate, her marriage felt more like a carefully orchestrated performance, where she played the role of a silent decorative figure. At first, she tried to ignore the subtle slights, the casual dismissals of her presence. She reminded herself that moving in with a spouse's family was always an adjustment, that perhaps she was overanalyzing things. But the reality became undeniable. She was not welcome in this house. The Barclay estate was a sprawling, opulent mansion, the kind that had been passed down through generations of old money. It sat atop acres of perfectly manicured land, with a grand oak-lined driveway that led to towering white columns and massive double doors. Inside, the house was a museum of Southern aristocracy, mahogany staircases, chandeliers dripping with crystals, hand-painted portraits of long-dead Barclays lining the hallways. And now, she was expected to live here. She soon realized that, despite being Jason's wife, she had little say in anything that happened within these walls. His mother, Eleanor Barclay, controlled the household with an iron grip, orchestrating everything from the menu for dinner to the guest list for the endless social gatherings they hosted. Layla was merely an accessory, someone to be presented when necessary, and ignored the rest of the time. The staff took their cues from Eleanor, treating Layla with the same distant politeness. They answered when spoken to, but there was no warmth in their voices. She wasn't the lady of the house. She was an outsider who had forced her way in. Whenever she entered a room, conversations would halt for the briefest of moments, before resuming as if she weren't there. When she sat down for breakfast, she was often met with silence, the rustling of newspapers and the clinking of silverware filling the void where polite conversation should have been. Jason noticed none of this, or, more accurately, he chose not to. She tried to talk to him about it once, After another uncomfortable dinner where his parents spoke of family legacies and traditions as though she didn't exist. "They're just old-fashioned," Jason had said dismissively, stretching out on their bed as if her concerns were nothing more than minor inconveniences. "They'll warm up to you eventually." But they never did. Instead, Eleanor found new ways to make her presence feel unwelcome. There were the carefully worded suggestions about how Layla might consider dressing more appropriately for certain events, as if the elegant gowns she wore weren't good enough. There were the pointed comments about the way she spoke, the food she ate, the background she came from. And then there was Richard Barclay, who didn't bother with subtlety. "If you ever need anything, just let one of us know," he had said once, his smile cold. "I imagine things are a bit different here than what you're used to." It wasn't a question. It was a reminder that she didn't belong. Through it all, Jason remained indifferent. Layla told herself that he loved her, that he had married her, despite knowing his family would disapprove. But love, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as loyalty. Jason loved her in the quiet moments, in the privacy of their bedroom, in the way he kissed her in the morning before leaving for his business meetings. But in front of his family, in the face of their rejection, he did nothing. Her only escape was the garden. It was the one place where she could be alone, where she didn't have to endure the constant reminder that she was unwanted. The garden stretched out behind the estate, filled with blooming magnolias and meticulously maintained hedges. She would spend hours there, walking along the stone paths, breathing in the scent of flowers, reminding herself that she was still a person, still someone who had a life before this. But even that wasn't enough to ease the growing weight of her isolation. Then she became pregnant. When she found out, she felt a rush of emotions: joy, fear, uncertainty. Would this child bring her and Jason closer? Would his family finally accept her? She wanted to believe that a baby would change things, that with a grandchild on the way, Eleanor and Richard would finally see her as part of the family. She was wrong. The news was met with the same detached politeness that had greeted her wedding. "Well," Eleanor had said, her expression unreadable, "I suppose congratulations are in order." Richard barely reacted at all, simply nodding before returning to his newspaper. Jason, at least, was excited. He had lifted her in his arms, kissed her, whispered about the future they would have. But as the months passed, she saw the same pattern repeating. His love was real, but his ability to stand up for her was non-existent. When she voiced her concerns about how they would raise their child, Eleanor quickly asserted control. "Of course, we'll make sure the baby is raised properly," she said. Layla frowned. "I'll be raising my child." Eleanor had simply smiled. That was the first time Layla felt true fear. She wasn't just an unwanted guest in this house. She was an afterthought. And now, she realized, they saw her baby as a Barclay, someone who would be shaped and molded into their traditions, regardless of what she wanted. She was losing control of her own life. The pregnancy was difficult, made worse by the stress of living under the Barclays' roof. Jason continued to travel often, leaving her alone with his parents, who treated her as if she were nothing more than a vessel carrying their heir. She spent nights awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she had ended up here. She had been a surgeon, a woman with her own career, her own ambitions. Now she was just Jason's wife. When Sophia was born, Layla thought for a brief moment that everything would change. But as she held her daughter in her arms for the first time, she looked around the hospital room and realized that nothing had. Eleanor stood by the window, arms crossed, looking down at the baby with an unreadable expression. Richard had barely spoken. Jason, though happy, seemed oblivious to the tension that filled the air. And Layla, exhausted from childbirth, felt a sinking dread settle in her chest. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her daughter. Motherhood was supposed to be a joyful experience, a transformation that would bring a woman closer to her family. But for Layla, it was the final chain locking her inside the Barclay estate. Sophia was barely a week old when Layla realized she wasn't the one raising her daughter. Eleanor took control effortlessly, as though she had been waiting for this moment. It began with subtle interventions, advising Layla on how to hold the baby properly, how often to feed her, what routines were best for her development. At first, Layla appreciated the help. She was exhausted, still healing from childbirth and adjusting to life with a newborn. But soon, Eleanor's guidance turned into directives. "You should rest," Eleanor said one evening, plucking Sophia from Layla's arms without waiting for permission. "I'll keep her in my room for the night." Layla wanted to protest, but Jason nodded in agreement. "She's just trying to help," he murmured, rubbing Layla's shoulder. "You need sleep." Layla barely slept at all that night. By the time Sophia was 3 months old, it became clear that Eleanor saw her granddaughter as a Barclay before anything else. She dictated everything: what clothes Sophia wore, what lullabies were sung to her, even which visitors were allowed to see her. When Layla tried to voice her concerns, Eleanor dismissed them with a patient, patronizing smile. "She's part of this family," Eleanor would say. "She'll be raised as a Barclay should be." Layla began to feel like she was just a surrogate for the legacy of a family that had never accepted her. Jason, of course, didn't see it that way. "She's just excited to be a grandmother," he said when Layla confronted him. "She's not trying to replace you." But wasn't she? It was small things at first: Eleanor calling Sophia her little girl, speaking over Layla when discussing child care, making decisions without consulting her. Then came the bigger things. One morning, Layla walked into the nursery to find that Sophia's crib had been moved. The decor had changed. Instead of the soft, neutral colors Layla had chosen, the walls were now adorned with pastel pinks and gold, reminiscent of the estate's traditional style. Layla clenched her fists. Who did this? Eleanor, who had been adjusting Sophia's blanket, turned with an air of practiced innocence. "Oh, the room needed a bit of Barclay charm." Layla gritted her teeth. "This is my daughter's room." "And she is my granddaughter," Eleanor replied smoothly. "We all want what's best for her." Layla turned on her heel and walked away before she said something she would regret. But the worst part wasn't Eleanor. It was Jason. Whenever Layla tried to discuss the situation with him, he shut down. "I don't see the problem," he would say. "Sophia's fine." "You're overreacting." She wasn't overreacting. She was being erased. The realization hit her fully one afternoon when she saw Eleanor speaking to one of the estate staff. "Miss Sophia should be introduced to the right people as she grows," Eleanor was saying. "She has a legacy to uphold." Miss Sophia. Not Layla's daughter. Not their child. Just another Barclay. It was as if Layla didn't exist. That night, as she lay awake beside Jason, staring at the ceiling, she knew something had to change. She couldn't let this continue. But how? She had no support, no allies in this house. Her friends were hundreds of miles away in New York. Her career, her independence, everything she had built for herself, it was all gone. She had thought that by marrying Jason, she would build a new life. But she had only given up the one she already had. And now, she was watching her daughter being pulled into the same gilded cage. She had to do something. The answer came unexpectedly one evening. She was in the study, flipping through a book on estate law, something Eleanor had left out. It wasn't what she was looking for, but one particular section caught her eye. Inheritance laws. Custody laws. The Barclays had always controlled everything through legal loopholes, using contracts and trusts to protect their interests. If she wanted to fight them, she had to be smart. She had to be prepared. Layla had always fought for what mattered. She had fought her way through medical school, through residency, through every challenge that had tried to break her. She would fight for Sophia too. But first, she had to be patient. She wasn't ready yet. But she would be. Layla had spent weeks dreading the annual Barclay business dinner. It was one of the biggest events of the year, a gathering of powerful figures from the South's wealthiest circles. Politicians, businessmen, and landowners, all united by their shared status. And, as Layla had come to realize, their unspoken rules about who did and did not belong. From the moment the preparations began, she knew what was expected of her. To stand beside Jason. To smile at the guests. And, most importantly, to remain silent. Eleanor had been particularly insistent about the evening's importance. "This dinner has been a tradition in our family for generations," she said one morning over breakfast. "It's a reflection of everything the Barclays stand for." She didn't say it outright, but Layla understood the implication. She was an outsider. A blemish on their perfect legacy. And tonight, she was expected to play her part without disrupting the image Eleanor worked so hard to maintain. The estate was transformed for the occasion. The dining hall, already grand, was made even more ostentatious with candlelit chandeliers, crystal glassware, and table arrangements that looked like something out of a royal banquet. Dozens of staff members moved in perfect synchronization, preparing the evening down to the finest detail. Layla felt like she was suffocating before the event even began. She had never been someone who cared for wealth and excess. But in the Barclays world, everything was about appearances. When Jason finally entered their bedroom that evening, dressed in his tailored black suit, he barely glanced at her before adjusting his cufflinks. "You ready?" he asked casually. Layla looked at herself in the mirror. Her gown, selected by Eleanor, was an elegant deep blue, simple, yet refined. Meant to make her blend in rather than stand out. She had learned long ago that wearing anything too bold would invite criticism. Even her jewelry had been chosen for her, a pair of pearls Eleanor had gifted her, a silent reminder of the kind of woman she was expected to be. "I'm ready," she said. Even though she wasn't. As the evening began, the guests arrived one by one, each grander than the last. Men in finely tailored suits. Women in shimmering dresses. Their laughter and conversation filling the air like a carefully rehearsed symphony. Layla stood by Jason's side, smiling at the introductions, shaking hands with strangers who barely acknowledged her. "Jason, good to see you. And this must be your wife. A pleasure to meet you, dear." Their words were polite. But their eyes told the truth. She wasn't one of them. She never would be. Dinner was served with precision, each course appearing as if by magic. Fine wine flowed freely, and conversation swirled around the table. Discussions of business ventures. Political alliances. And, of course, the importance of heritage. "I tell you," one of the guests, a senator, if she recalled correctly, said with a chuckle, "times are changing too fast. People forget where they come from." Across the table, Richard Barclay nodded in agreement. "That's why we preserve what we have. Family. Legacy. The foundation of everything." Eleanor smiled approvingly. Her gaze flicked toward Layla for the briefest of moments before returning to the conversation. Layla clenched her fists beneath the table. She knew they weren't speaking directly about her. But the message was clear. Then, the moment came. It was subtle. So expertly executed that if Layla had been less prepared, she might have thought it was a mistake. Jason's sister, Caroline, a woman who had never hidden her disdain for Layla, lifted her glass of red wine as if to make a toast. To tradition, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And then, with a perfectly calculated flick of her wrist, she tipped the glass forward. The deep red liquid cascaded over the table, splashing onto Layla's gown, staining the delicate fabric like blood. A sharp gasp echoed through the room. "Oh," Caroline said, covering her mouth in mock surprise. "How clumsy of me." For a moment, time stood still. Layla felt the warm wine seeping into her dress, the sharp scent of alcohol filling her nostrils. She saw the way the guests looked at her, some feigning concern, others smirking behind their glasses. And then, the laughter began. Soft at first, polite chuckles rippling through the table. Jason did nothing. He didn't stand. He didn't offer her a napkin. Didn't even look at her properly. Instead, he sighed. Shook his head. As if she had been the one to embarrass him. Eleanor reached for her own napkin, dabbing at the tablecloth with a faint smile. "These things happen," she said lightly. Layla's hands trembled. She could feel her heart pounding, her throat tightening. But she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Without a word, she pushed back her chair and stood. Every eye in the room followed her as she picked up her napkin, carefully dabbed at her stained dress. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She was done. Turning on her heel, she walked out of the dining hall, her footsteps echoing against the marble floors. She didn't stop until she reached her room. Once inside, she locked the door, pressed her back against it, and let out a slow, shuddering breath. She had endured many things in this house. She had swallowed her pride, had allowed herself to be ignored, belittled, treated like an afterthought. But tonight had been different. Tonight, they had humiliated her. In front of their world. Tonight, Jason had let them. And tonight, something inside her finally snapped. She wouldn't stay. Not anymore. She moved quickly, her hand steady despite the fire burning in her chest. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for weeks, knowing that someday, inevitably, she would have to leave. The only question had been when. Tonight had given her the answer. She pulled a small suitcase from the back of her closet, the one she had packed weeks ago in secret. It wasn't much, just the essentials. A few changes of clothes for herself and Sophia, some cash she had stashed away, and the most important documents she would need for the fight ahead. She glanced at the clock. The dinner was still ongoing, the laughter from the dining hall drifting faintly through the mansion, proof that her absence had changed nothing. Good. She crossed the room quickly, opening Sophia's dresser and gathering her daughter's belongings. She hesitated only for a moment, her fingers brushing against one of the soft baby blankets Eleanor had insisted on embroidering with the Barclay family crest. She left it behind. This child was hers, not theirs. When she reached the nursery, Sophia was fast asleep in her crib, her tiny chest rising and falling peacefully. For a brief moment, Layla felt a pang of sadness. Her daughter had no idea what was happening, no idea that by morning, her world would be different. But it had to be. She leaned down, gently lifting Sophia into her arms. The little girl stirred but didn't wake. Holding her daughter close, Layla turned toward the door. And then she froze. Eleanor was standing in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The older woman's expression was unreadable, but there was something cold in her eyes. Something that told Layla that Eleanor had known this moment would come. "You can't take her," Eleanor said finally. Her voice was calm, measured. Not pleading. Not angry. Just stating the fact. Layla tightened her grip on Sophia. "She's my daughter." "She's a Barclay," Eleanor corrected. "And you are nothing without this family." Layla felt her pulse spike, but she refused to let the fear take hold. "Watch me." She stepped forward, but Eleanor didn't move. "You won't get far," Eleanor continued. "Jason will find you. He'll take you to court. And when that happens, do you really think they'll let you keep her?" Layla forced herself to stay calm. "I'll fight for her." Eleanor's lips curled into something resembling a smile. "With what resources? What power? You are alone, Layla. You are a single mother with no stable income, no home of your own, and no family influence. The courts don't favor women like you against men like my son." Layla felt the surge of rage rise in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She knew how Eleanor worked. She thrived on control, on intimidation. If Layla let her see even a sliver of doubt, she would pounce. So she lifted her chin. "Then I guess I'll have to change that." She stepped past Eleanor without another word, walking down the hall with Sophia nestled against her chest. Eleanor didn't follow. Layla didn't know if it was because she believed she would fail, or because she had already begun planning how to stop her. Either way, it didn't matter. Because this time, Layla was ready. She made it out of the house without anyone stopping her. The staff were still occupied with the dinner, and Jason was nowhere in sight. By the time she reached her car, her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. She strapped Sophia into the car seat as quickly as possible, glancing toward the mansion one last time. Then she got in and drove. The night swallowed them whole as she sped down the long, winding driveway. She didn't look back. By the time she reached the small hotel on the outskirts of town, exhaustion had begun to set in. Sophia was still asleep, unaware of the fact that their lives had just changed forever. Layla checked in using cash, not wanting to leave a trail on her credit card. Once inside the small, dimly lit room, she collapsed onto the bed, holding Sophia close. She had done it. She had left. But this was only the beginning. Jason wouldn't just let her go. He wouldn't let Sophia go. She had started a war tonight. And she intended to win it. Layla woke to the sound of her phone vibrating against the nightstand. The cheap hotel room was still cloaked in darkness, but a soft golden hue peeked through the thin curtains, signaling dawn. Her first instinct was to reach for Sophia, but the little girl was still sleeping peacefully, curled against Layla's side. The phone buzzed again. She already knew who it was before she picked it up. Jason. She hesitated, then declined the call. She had nothing to say to him. A second later, another message appeared. "Where the hell are you?" Then another. "You think you can just take my daughter and run? Come back now, and we can fix this." Layla scoffed. Fix this? There was no fixing what had happened. She ignored the messages and put the phone down, focusing on her next steps. She had prepared for this. At least, as much as she could. But now, it was real. Now, she had to execute the plan she had spent months piecing together in secret. She needed legal protection. She needed money. And, most of all, she needed to ensure that the Barclays could never take Sophia from her. She carefully slid out of bed without waking Sophia and grabbed the manila folder she had stuffed into her bag the night before. Inside were the documents she had been collecting for weeks. Bank statements, copies of financial transactions, and the business reports she had managed to get her hands on. The Barclays had built their empire on money and power. But they weren't as untouchable as they thought. Layla had suspected for some time that Richard Barclay, Jason's father, had been involved in some questionable dealings. She had overheard conversations in hushed tones. Seen documents left unattended in the study. She wasn't an expert in corporate law, but even she had recognized the red flags. Now, she just needed someone who could use them. By mid-morning, she was sitting in a small law office in the city, waiting for the attorney she had secretly contacted weeks ago. His name was Daniel Lawson. A sharp, no-nonsense lawyer with a reputation for taking on powerful families and winning. When he finally stepped into the room, he eyed her carefully before taking a seat. "I was expecting you," he said, opening a folder of his own. Though I hoped it wouldn't come to this. Layla took a deep breath. I left last night. They're going to come after me. Daniel nodded. They already have. He slid his phone across the desk. On the screen was a news article. Missing Barclay heiress taken by mother in shocking disappearance. Layla felt her stomach turn as she read the subheading. Jason Barclay, devastated over the sudden abduction of his daughter, has vowed to take legal action to bring her home. She clenched her fists. They're already controlling the narrative. Daniel leaned back. That's what they do. But we're not going to let them win. She handed him the folder she had brought. This is everything I could find. Financial discrepancies. Offshore accounts. Under-the-table deals. If there's anything illegal in there, I need you to find it. Daniel flipped through the documents, his expression darkening with each page. This is interesting, he said finally. Enough to make them nervous, but not enough to bring them down. Layla's heart sank. Then what do I do? Daniel exhaled slowly. We fight. We start by filing for custody immediately. We paint the real picture, an emotionally abusive household, an absent father, and a mother who had no choice but to leave to protect her child. Layla nodded. And if they fight back? They will, Daniel said. They'll try to prove that you're unstable. That you're incapable of raising Sophia. They'll use their money, their influence, everything they have. Layla clenched her jaw. Then I need to be ready. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. You're tougher than they think, he finally said. She straightened. They're about to find out. The courtroom was colder than Layla expected. Not physically, there was a steady hum of air conditioning keeping the space at a neutral temperature, but emotionally, it was sterile. Impersonal. She sat beside Daniel Lawson, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across the room, Jason sat with his own team of lawyers, his expression unreadable. But she knew what was underneath that carefully controlled facade. Rage. Control slipping through his fingers. Layla forced herself to sit upright, to steady her breathing. She had known this day would come from the moment she left the Barclay estate. The moment she defied them, she had set this battle into motion. Now she just had to win. The judge entered the room, an older man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. The court rose, then sat as he took his seat. This court is now in session for the matter of custody regarding minor child Sophia Barclay, the judge announced. Both parties have filed for full custody. We will hear arguments from both sides. Jason's lawyer stood first, a sleek, well-groomed man with the kind of confidence that came from representing the powerful. Your Honor, he began smoothly, this case is not complicated. My client, Jason Barclay, is a responsible father. He comes from a well-established family with deep roots in the community. He has the resources, the stability, and the means to provide his daughter with the best life possible. Layla bristled. The best life possible. They meant wealth. They meant a family name. They meant control. The lawyer continued, pacing slowly. Miss Williams, excuse me, Dr. Williams, acted irrationally. She abducted her daughter in the middle of the night without so much as a discussion. She did not seek mediation. She did not attempt a legal separation first. Instead, she took matters into her own hands, removing the child from her home, her father, and the only life she has ever known. He turned toward the judge. The Barclays are a respected family. They have deep moral values, a strong sense of tradition, and a legacy that they are committed to upholding. Sophia Barclay deserves to be raised in that environment, surrounded by family who can provide her with structure, discipline, and the best opportunities available. Layla's hands curled into fists. She could feel the judge's eyes on her, assessing her. Already weighing Jason's wealth against whatever argument she was about to present. Then Daniel stood. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firm but calm, "this case is not about wealth. It is not about tradition. It is about what is best for a child." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Daniel picked up a file and flipped it open. "Let's talk about the structure and stability Mr. Barclay's family claims to offer," he said. "Let's talk about what life at the Barclay estate was really like for my client." Jason shifted in his seat. Daniel continued. Dr. Williams has provided evidence that she was emotionally isolated, belittled, and treated as an outsider in her own home. Her concerns as a mother were dismissed. Her role was minimized. And her husband, instead of defending her, stood by and allowed it to happen. Layla looked at Jason, daring him to deny it. He didn't. Daniel flipped to the next page in his file. As for Mr. Barclay himself, let's talk about what kind of father he has been. He turned to Jason's lawyer. Tell me, when was the last time Mr. Barclay spent a full day with his daughter? Fed her? Bathed her? Read her a bedtime story? Jason's jaw tightened. Daniel pressed on. He works long hours. He travels frequently for business. And when he is home, he is not the one caring for Sophia. That responsibility fell to her mother. The same mother they are now trying to paint as unfit. Jason's lawyer stood. Objection. That is speculation. Daniel held up a stack of emails. These are communication records from Mr. Barclay's assistant, showing how often he was away on business over the past year. Months at a time. And yet he is claiming to be the parent best suited to raise a child? The judge looked at Jason's lawyer. Do you have a rebuttal? Jason's lawyer hesitated. My client's work is demanding, yes, but... Daniel didn't let him finish. Demanding, perhaps. But I would argue that a parent who is too busy to raise their own child should not be demanding sole custody of them. The courtroom was silent. Then Daniel pulled out his final piece of evidence. And finally, Your Honor, I would like to present financial records that show discrepancies in the Barclay family business. Jason's face darkened. These records indicate offshore accounts, questionable transactions, and potential tax fraud. And given that Mr. Barclay is asking this court to determine who is the more stable parent, I believe these details are relevant. Jason's lawyer turned to his client, whispering furiously. Jason glared at Layla. She met his gaze without flinching. The judge exhaled and leaned forward. This is a complex case, he said. I will need time to review all the evidence presented. In the meantime, temporary custody will remain with Dr. Williams until a final ruling is made. Layla let out a slow breath. It wasn't over. But it was a start. As court adjourned, Jason stormed past her, his voice low and furious. You think you've won? Layla didn't look away. I think I've only just begun. She sat in her small apartment that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to relax even though she should have been sleeping. The legal battle had drained her in ways she had never imagined. And though temporary custody had been granted in her favor, she knew that Jason and his family would not let this go easily. Sophia was asleep in the next room, curled up in the blankets, her tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. That sight alone was enough to strengthen Layla's resolve. She had fought too hard to let them take her daughter away. The final custody hearing was set for the next morning. Everything was on the line. Daniel had assured her that they had presented a strong case: Jason's frequent absences, the financial irregularities in the Barclay empire, and most importantly, Layla's role as the primary caretaker of Sophia. But she also knew that power and influence had a way of tilting justice. She forced herself to close her eyes. She needed to be rested. Tomorrow, she would fight. The courtroom was packed when Layla arrived the next morning, dressed in a navy blue blazer and a crisp white blouse. She had wanted to wear something that exuded confidence, but also reminded the court that she was not just a mother. She was a doctor. A woman who had built her life with her own hands. Jason was already there, dressed impeccably as always. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his jaw. The barely concealed frustration in his posture. Eleanor and Richard Barclay sat behind him. Their presence was an unspoken threat. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "We are here today to determine the final custody arrangement for minor child Sophia Barclay," the judge began. "I have reviewed all submitted evidence, testimony, and relevant financial records. Before rendering my decision, I will allow both parties one final statement." Jason's lawyer stood first. "Your Honor, my client is a man of integrity. He is a devoted father, a provider, and a respected figure in his community. While the mother has shown herself to be a competent caregiver, we must consider the long-term stability and financial security of the child. Mr. Barclay's resources allow him to provide Sophia with a future that few can offer." Layla clenched her fists under the table. It was always about money with them. Then Daniel stood. "Your Honor," he began, "we are not here to determine which parent is wealthier. We are here to determine what is in the best interest of the child." He gestured toward Layla. "My client has been the sole emotional and physical caretaker of Sophia since birth. She has fed her, bathed her, stayed awake with her through fevers and nightmares. She is not an absent parent. She is not a provider in title only. She is a mother who has given everything for her child." The judge leaned back in his chair. Silence stretched through the courtroom. Then he spoke. "The court finds that it is in the best interest of the child to remain in the sole custody of her mother, Dr. Layla Williams." She had one. Jason shot to his feet. "This is insane." The judge fixed him with a hard stare. "Sit down, Mr. Barclay." Layla stood slowly, her heart filled with triumph. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving the Barclays behind. That battle was over. She had won. Layla stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air, the weight of the last few months pressing against her shoulders. The relief was overwhelming, but she knew this wasn't truly the end. Jason wouldn't stop fighting. He would exhaust every legal avenue, every connection, every ounce of power his family had to reverse the ruling. But she didn't care. She had won today, and that was enough. Daniel walked beside her, his briefcase swinging at his side. "They're going to appeal," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I know," she replied. "You'll need to be prepared for more fights. More hearings. More attempts to paint you as the unstable one." Layla stopped walking and turned to face him. "Let them try. Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. They underestimated you. That was their first mistake. She exhaled slowly, then glanced back at the courthouse. She knew Jason was still inside, most likely pacing, shouting at his lawyer, demanding to know how this had happened. Eleanor would be furious, her carefully constructed world cracking around her. Richard would already be planning his next move. It didn't matter. She adjusted her purse on her shoulder. I need to pick up Sophia. Daniel gave her a reassuring nod. Go be with your daughter. I'll handle the rest. She didn't hesitate. Layla drove straight to the small daycare she had enrolled Sophia in weeks ago, knowing that if she had any chance of winning full custody, she had to show she was providing a stable life for her daughter. When she walked in, the daycare staff greeted her with warm smiles, and Sophia, the moment she spotted her, squealed with delight. Mommy! Layla scooped her up into her arms, breathing in the familiar scent of baby powder and innocence. Sophia's tiny hands clung to her, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. You're coming home with me, baby, she whispered into her hair. Sophia giggled, oblivious to the battle that had just been fought for her. Layla carried her outside and buckled her into the car seat. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she felt lighter than she had in months. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Jason would never truly let go. The Barclays would always try to interfere, to remind her that she had taken something they believed belonged to them. But Sophia wasn't theirs. She was hers. That night, after putting Sophia to bed, Layla sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the papers Daniel had given her. Jason's legal team had already filed paperwork requesting an appeal. It was expected, but it still made her stomach turn. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion creeping in. She had left everything behind, her career, her city, her independence, just to escape them. And now, they were still trying to control her life. No. She wouldn't let them. Reaching for her phone, she scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she had been thinking about calling for weeks. She hesitated only a second before pressing dial. The phone rang twice, before a familiar voice answered. Dr. Williams, the voice said smoothly. I was wondering when you'd call. Layla took a deep breath. I'm ready. There was a pause. Then, good. Let's get started. She had spent enough time running. Now, it was time to rebuild. And this time, no one, not Jason, not Eleanor, not the entire Barclay empire, was going to stop her. Layla stared out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The world outside moved on as if nothing had changed, but for her, everything was different. She had won custody of Sophia, but the war wasn't truly over. Jason's appeal was looming, and she knew he wouldn't stop until he had exhausted every option. The Barclays never lost, and they wouldn't accept defeat now. She took a slow sip of her tea, letting the warmth settle in her chest. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had come too far, fought too hard to let them take anything else from her. For the first time in years, she had control over her own life. Sophia stirred in the other room, murmuring softly in her sleep. Layla stood and walked to the doorway, leaning against the frame as she watched her daughter, her tiny hands curled into fists, her breathing steady and peaceful. This was why she had fought. This was why she had endured the humiliation, the isolation, the fear. Jason had called twice that evening, but she hadn't answered. She knew what he would say, how he would try to twist things in his favor. He had spent their entire marriage convincing her to be silent, to be grateful, to accept her place. But she had found her voice, and she would never let him silence her again. Her phone buzzed on the table. Another message from Jason. "This isn't over." She turned the screen off and set the phone down. Yes, it was. She walked to Sophia's bed, gently brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. The Barclays could keep their wealth, their influence, their power. None of it mattered anymore. She had everything she needed right here. Tomorrow, she would start again. She would rebuild her career, create a home, give Sophia the life she deserved. Not one built on expectations and control, but on love, freedom, and choice. She kissed Sophia's forehead and whispered, "We're free now, baby." Then she turned off the light, knowing that for the first time in a long time, she would sleep peacefully.